So this is my review of Davos' fourth A Storm of Swords chapter. It's probably my favorite chapter in that book, give or take Sam's first one and Sansa's last one, and it's a chapter that for good reason looms very large in the fandom, so let's hope I do it justice. I'm also going to be talking about Davos' A Storm of Swords storyline as a whole, because it's so well written and well constructed that to talk about one chapter, you really have to talk about the whole thing. In the wake of his devastating loss on the Blackwater, on the brink of total defeat, Stannis' back is up against the wall. And when Davos returns from the dead, the king turns desperately to his Onion Knight for a moral foundation, even as the Onion Knight is increasingly convinced he has to act without his king's knowledge or consent. Team Dragonstone is somewhat removed from the larger movements of the plot in The Storm of Swords, allowing the characters to comment on the wider story before interjecting themselves in it near the very end. And this isolation allows for an almost theater-like focus on a handful of characters interacting intensely in a confined, well-defined space. And what we get out of it is perhaps Martin's most complex and moving examination of loyalty, leadership, ethics, judgment, doubt, sacrifice, and redemption. Davos' final chapter in The Storm of Swords is the payoff for all that, and it's the purest of the bunch. But Davos' fourth chapter, I think, is the most emotionally satisfying. And I think the reason I got more requests for this chapter by far than any other is because on one level it's the most triumphant chapter in the series. It's the story of a good man being rewarded and elevated for his honest service and moral compass, and the story of a flawed king learning to rise above his grievances and become a better one. On the other hand, again, it's the middle of Davos' A Storm of Swords arc, not the end, so it introduces tensions to be resolved in his final two chapters, and I think Martin is critiquing and complicating his characters as well as showcasing their best selves. Now, the chapter begins with Davos sharing a cell with Lord Alistair Florent, formerly Hand of the King. And the Florents are the anti-Davos, basically, right? Where he is honest, they are deceitful. Where he is humble, they are prideful. Where he is loyal, they are not. But it's not purely cartoonish. I think one of Martin's great skills as a writer is how well he separates the truly evil from the merely cartoonish. And I think that we see a great example of that right away with the Florent brothers in the text. "Take the torch," Sir Axel commanded the jailer. "Leave the traitor to the darkness." "No," his brother said. "Axel, please, don't take the light. Gods have mercy." "Gods? There is only R'hllor and the other." I love how Martin does that. He writes "his brother said" instead of "Lord Alistair said," just to emphasize that Axel is doing this to his brother. So if Alistair represents the rot in Dragonstone, Axel represents the venality that's moving into that vacuum, and Davos has to save his king and kingdom from both. But it's not a pure or a simple victory. I think it's a hideous irony that the last we see of Alistair Florent is that the fire is being taken away from him, given his eventual fate. Davos saves Edric Storm from the fires, but you could say that R'hllor demands Alistair Florent in his place. And while Davos is of course right to encourage Stannis to go to the wall, Alistair Florent is the necessary sacrifice to make that even possible. So there's a real moral ambiguity to how this storyline shakes out. But that's getting ahead of myself. Back to the chapter. Obviously, the central scene here is the reunion between Stannis and Davos. And keep in mind, it's been a long time since not only Davos, but we have seen Stannis. We last saw him at Storm's End roughly 2/3 of the way through A Clash of Kings. Now, this is the first time we've seen him in A Storm of Swords, and that's about halfway through the book. So there's a lot of build-up to this moment. And as Davos says, Stannis is not doing well. He looks a lot older, his face is even more drawn than usual. Something is rotten in the state of Dragonstone. So Stannis needs Davos for both political and emotional reasons. He needs Davos not only to help him with the work ahead, but to help him come to terms with how to think and feel about that work. Stannis needs a shot in the arm, right? He needs an existential rejuvenation. He needs a reminder of why he's doing this. And he appeals to Davos in that context specifically as someone Stannis thinks of as a better man than he is. That's the crux of their relationship. And that becomes the core of Davos' theory of the handship, which is our fourth in the series after Ned, Tyrion, and Tywin. How Davos thinks about being the hand is not at all just taking the king's orders, but in fact doing quite the opposite, doing what the king cannot or refuses to, acting where the king can't. Davos has to save the king from himself and save the monarchy from the king, which as it happens is a direct parallel to how Jaime comes to think about the Kingsguard in A Storm of Swords and A Feast for Crows. And for Davos, of course, this all revolves around the figure of Edric Storm. Now, everyone keeps imposing narratives on that poor kid, right? Melisandre thinks of him as a vessel for king's blood, Selyse conceives of him as a living curse upon her marriage, and Stannis definitely filters his perspective on his nephew through his perspectives on Robert and Renly. Davos is the one to cut through all that noise and say no. Edric Storm matters because he is a person, full stop. And not only that, but you, Stannis, you are no true king if you devote your kingdom to any other concept than that. And indeed, it's Stannis' self-conception as a king that's really at stake in this scene, because he brings in Davos to evaluate Axel Florent's own plan of rejuvenation, his own plan shot in the arm for Stannis' campaign, which of course is the attack on Claw Isle. And Davos' reaction to this is one of the great moral triumphs in the story, because of course, just before the scene, right outside, Axel threatened Davos' life if Davos didn't support this plan and support Axel as hand. And yet, when it comes to the moment, the king turned back to Davos. "Speak truly, sir. What do you make of Sir Axel's proposal?" "Speak truly, sir." Davos remembered the dark cell he had shared with Lord Allister, remembered lamprey and porridge. He thought of the promises that Sir Axel had made on the bridge above the yard. A ship or a shove, what shall it be? But this was Stannis asking. "Your Grace," he said slowly, "I make it folly, aye, and cowardice." So let's look at the levels of Davos' argument when it comes to Claw Isle. On one level, what he is saying is that attacking Claw Isle is a profound misunderstanding of the war and why Stannis is fighting it. Davos makes an important distinction here between enemies and traitors. Now, obviously, technically, anyone who's not supporting Stannis at this point is a traitor as far as Stannis is concerned. But there are degrees here, and interests and intent and mitigating factors and good qualities, all of these things matter a great deal. And Stannis knows that. He made that argument when he was distinguishing between Renly supporters and Robb supporters back at Storm's End. And Davos reminds Stannis of the importance of this distinction, and that Axel Florent refuses to see that distinction, between fighting the Lannisters and fighting people who came when Stannis called, as Davos puts it. That emphasizes how Axel really is the caricature of Stannis. He represents the pure, unyielding, off-with-their-heads logic that Stannis himself didn't even practice in the Clash of Kings. And that Davos puts forward a much more considered and big-picture argument is a sign of a sorely overlooked aspect of his character, which is that from Dragonstone to Storm's End to White Harbor, Davos Seaworth is interested in and good at politics. He's always thinking about coalitions. He's always thinking about public appearance. He's always thinking about the power dynamics at play in a room. I mean, it's a rare kind of man who would have dared the siege lines during Robert's Rebellion as he did, not knowing what his fate would be, even if he succeeded. Davos' life and the lives of his loved ones have been forever shaped by that daring insertion of himself onto the political stage. So he's not really a novice at this, really, not at all. The second level of this argument is a directly moral one, and that's contained in this line. "Claw Isle is weakly held, yes. Held by women and children and old men. And why is that? Because their husbands and sons and fathers died on the Blackwater, that's why. Died at their oars, or with swords in their hands, fighting beneath our banners. Yet Sir Axel proposes we sweep down on the homes they left behind, to rape their widows and put their children to the sword." Yeah, Stannis really needs to hear this, because at this point in his storyline, he's really thinking about the Blackwater as just a blow done to him, right? A wound done to his political campaign. But that's not really what the Blackwater was, first and foremost. First and foremost, the Blackwater was a jade holocaust, as they describe it in the book. It was this atrocity into which families like Davos's were fed. And when he's talking about these, defenseless families on Claw Isle, let's be real, he's talking about his own family as well. And Stannis needs to take responsibility for what happened in the Blackwater and its aftermath. I mean, I guess he doesn't have to technically. He could just say that, no, all my former lords were bending the knee to Joffrey now. All of them should have let Ill and Payne take their heads rather than do that. He can say that, but at that point, he's just a protest candidate. He's not a serious long-term candidate for the kingship. And Davos reminds him of that, and Stannis basically rewards him by empowering Davos to act as his better half. And I think that makes Davos kind of an interesting parallel to the Shadow Baby in a way. If the Shadow Baby is Stannis' most violent self sent out to kill, then Davos represents Stannis' nurturing self sent out to save, whether that's Edric Storm, or the people of Claw Isle, or the Night's Watch, or as it currently stands, Rickon. Sorry, one second. Let me find my place. Yes. But despite of how kind of gooey I'm being about Stannis and Davos' relationship, Davos isn't fully successful in his argument here. There's a level at which he does not manage to convince Stannis in terms of some men are stronger than others. Stannis does not accept that as a morally significant or, I guess, logistically significant notion. And so Davos has to throw a Hail Mary. "It is every man's duty to remain loyal to his rightful king, even if the lord he serves proves false," Stannis declared in a tone that brooked no argument. A desperate folly took hold of Davos, a recklessness akin to madness. "As you remain loyal to King Aerys when your brother raised his banners?" he blurted. This is an interesting argument because obviously there's no direct parallel between Stannis and the lords that are currently bending the knee in King's Landing. In fact, they're contrasts. Stannis was risking his neck to defy a bloodthirsty tyrant, and his former lords are saving their neck by bending the knee to a bloodthirsty tyrant. But that contrast is exactly Davos' point. He's saying to Stannis, look, by this pure, unyielding logic you're practicing now, you'd have to condemn yourself back when I saved you, back during Robert's Rebellion. So that's how you know that the logic you're using is too strict, it's too simplistic, it doesn't relate to the real world, and it's not the kind of king you want to be, it's not the kind of man you want to be. I know you better than this. And it's that element, that element of Davos looking at Stannis and saying, this is not you, and I know that more than anybody. The fire that lights in Stannis is such a powerful thing to witness. And it's purely existential at this point, right? It's not situational. He hasn't applied it to anything yet. That waits for the end of the book. But nonetheless, he knows who he is, and he knows who Davos is, and Davos knows who he is. And this clarity and empathy, I think, is really, really part of what makes what comes next so powerful.
Sir Davos of House Seaworth, the king said, are you my true and honest liege man, now and forever? I am, your grace. Do you swear to serve me loyally all your days, to give me honest counsel and swift obedience, to defend my rights and my realm against all foes in battles great and small, to protect my people and punish my enemies? I do, your grace. Then rise again, Davos Seaworth, and rise as Lord of the Rainwood, Admiral of the Narrow Sea, and Hand of the King.
So why do we love this as much as we do? I think, again, there are both emotional and political reasons for it. Emotionally, it works so well because Stannis so rarely allows himself a moment like this. He so rarely allows himself pure expression of these, again, utterly empathetic emotions, of the love and gratitude he's showing here. It hits all the harder because we don't usually see this from Stannis. And politically speaking, of course, the key line here is when Davos protests that Stannis' other lords will never accept him as hand, Stannis replies, then we will make new lords. And that is Stannis Baratheon at his absolute best. It shows how much he's maturing as a king, because back in A Clash of Kings, all Stannis could think about was uprooting his enemies. All Stannis could think about was getting rid of the rot of Robert's regime. But now he's starting to think about, okay, but what comes next? What kind of king do I want to be? How would I improve on Robert? And now we get his answer, basically. He's setting Davos as the standard. Basically, everyone from the lords to the small folk has to meet the standard set by Davos Seaworth, his hand, his model for how all loyal vassals should behave. And that is, it's extremely heartwarming if you love these characters as much as I do. But I think it's very important that the chapter doesn't end there. It could, there could be a great chapter that ends on the line, then we will make new lords. But that's not what Martin is up to. Where Martin ends is a reminder of, again, the work Davos has still yet to do in these next two chapters. It ends with a reminder of why it's important that Davos is Stannis' hand. And that, of course, is the leeches. And I love how Martin does this. I love how he writes this scene because he shows how Davos has gotten into Stannis' head, how Davos' earlier argument about the strict, simplistic argument you're making with this logic that recognizes no division among humanity and no interest or mitigating factors at all. You can see that Stannis has heard that argument and is taking it seriously. And Martin does that so subtly with the writing of the leech scene, and it's so masterful.
The usurper, he said, Joffrey Baratheon. When he tossed the leech onto the fire, it curled up like an autumn leaf amidst the coals and burned. Stannis grasped the second. The usurper, he declared, louder this time. Balon Greyjoy. He flipped it lightly onto the brazier, and the flesh split and cracked. The blood burst from it, hissing and smoking. The last was in the king's hand. This one he studied a moment, as it writhed between his fingers. The usurper, he said at last. Robb Stark. And he threw it on the flames. It's so perfectly written because you can see the internal struggle of Stannis realizing this is not moral, what I'm doing here. I mean, put aside the question of whether it has anything to do with their deaths, which it almost certainly doesn't. This, again, the logic, the connections he's drawing between these three men is unfair. And he knows that deep down that this is not the kind of king he wants to be. This is not the kind of man he wants to be. And that's how you know that Davos' argument at the end of this arc is going to work. That's how you know that Stannis is going to listen to him. That's how you know Stannis is going to go north. And how you know that Stannis Baratheon wants to save the kingdom to win the throne. And I think I will leave it there. Thanks for watching.